"You're an eyesore, Valeria. Get out." Valeria Cruz couldn't believe those words were coming from the man she loved. The man she promised to spend forever with. The man who was the father of her unborn child. Standing in her own hallway, drenched in sweat and heavy with pregnancy, Valeria watched her husband Brandon point toward the front door. No mercy. No regret. Just a cold, heartless demand. "I'm done with you. Get out before I have security drag you through the mud." Within minutes, Valeria was shoved out into a literal nightmare. She stood in the pouring rain, her thin dress clinging to her pregnant belly, her heart shattered and her life in danger. But what Brandon didn't realize was that he didn't just throw away a wife. He handed her over to a predator. Because the woman he abandoned in the storm was about to be picked up by the most feared Mafia boss in the city. Before we reveal how Brandon's empire begins to crumble, take a second to hit that subscribe button. If you believe that no woman should be treated the way Valeria was, show your support by giving this video a like. The story of Valeria and Brandon started few months ago. Valeria often felt like the expensive crystal vase that sat on their marble entryway table. Beautiful to look at, but hollow inside. Life with Brandon Whitmore was a series of perfectly timed events. Her hair had to be smooth, her smile had to be soft, and her opinions had to be non-existent. She lived in a sprawling estate with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city, but most days, it felt more like a cage than a home. Brandon was a man who measured love in stock prices and social standing. When they first met, he had treated her like a prize. He bought her designer dresses that cost more than her father's car and took her to galas where everyone whispered about how lucky she was. For a while, she believed the fairy tale. She thought his controlling nature was just a sign that he wanted to protect her. "You're my greatest asset, Valeria," he would say during their quiet dinners, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. He never said "I love you." He said asset. Back then, she let it slide, thinking it was just how powerful businessmen talked. As her pregnancy progressed, the perfection Brandon demanded became harder to maintain. Her feet ached, her back hurt, and she started to prefer cozy sweaters over the tight, elegant silk gowns he favored. She noticed the way his eyes would narrow when she struggled to stand up from the sofa. The warmth that was already thin began to turn into a deep, biting frost. He started coming home later. When he did walk through the door, he didn't head to the nursery to check on the progress of the crib. He headed straight to his office. The house grew quiet, filled only with the sound of the ticking clock and the wind hitting the glass. Valeria spent her evenings sitting in the dark, hand resting on her stomach, feeling the little kicks of a baby who had no idea how cold the atmosphere in the house had become. One evening, she found a receipt for a jewelry set she had never seen. It wasn't for a necklace or a ring meant for a pregnant wife. It was for something trendy, something young. When she asked him about it, Brandon didn't even look up from his phone. "Don't be tedious, Valeria," he snapped. "It's a business gift. Stick to the guest list for the charity auction and stay out of my ledger." That was the first time she felt a real chill in her bones. She realized that in Brandon's world, when an asset loses its shine, it gets replaced. She looked at her reflection in the dark window, her silhouette changed by the life growing inside her, and wondered how much longer she had before the door locked from the outside. She didn't have to wait long to find out. As the months passed, the man Valeria had married seemed to vanish, replaced by a stranger with ice in his veins. Brandon no longer looked at her with pride. Instead, he looked at her with a heavy sense of annoyance. To him, her growing belly wasn't a miracle. It was a mess. It was a distraction from the high-powered, sleek life he wanted to lead. The dinners that used to be filled with conversation were now silent, except for the sound of Brandon tapping away on his phone. He started staying out until 2 or 3 in the morning, claiming he was closing deals, but he would return smelling of expensive perfume and smoke. When Valeria tried to wait up for him, hoping for just a few minutes of his time, he would walk past her as if she were a piece of furniture. "You're still up?" he'd ask, his voice dripping with irritation. "You look exhausted, Valeria." "It's not a good look." The new interest Brandon had found wasn't just a hobby. It was a person. Her name was Elena, a young, ambitious socialite who didn't have swollen ankles or a heart full of worries. Valeria saw the photos on social media. Brandon at exclusive clubs, laughing with a woman who looked exactly like the person Valeria used to be before the pregnancy. One afternoon, Valeria was in the nursery, carefully folding tiny white onesies, when she heard Brandon talking loudly on the balcony. "It's almost over," he told someone over the phone, his tone light and cheerful. The family man phase was a good PR move, but it's becoming a burden. "I'm making arrangements to move her out. I need my space back, and I need you in it." Valeria's heart dropped. She stood frozen, clutching a small baby sock, her breath hitching in her chest. He wasn't just drifting away. He was planning an exit. She realized then that Brandon didn't see a daughter or a son in her womb. He saw a contract that was about to expire. That night, she tried one last time to reach him. She sat him down and placed her hand on her stomach. "Brandon, the baby is kicking. Don't you want to feel?" He didn't even look. He just stood up, adjusted his silk tie, and headed for the door. "I have a late meeting, Valeria. Don't wait up. And for heaven's sake, stop being so dramatic. It's just a child." He walked out, leaving her in a house that felt colder than the winter air outside. The mask had completely slipped, and the man underneath was someone Valeria didn't recognize at all. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear. If he was already talking about moving her out, where exactly did he expect a woman 8 months pregnant to go? She would find out much sooner than she ever imagined. The sky over the city didn't just rain. It opened up in a violent, howling rage. Inside the mansion, the air was even more terrifying. Brandon didn't even wait for Valeria to finish packing a bag. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin, and dragged her toward the grand entrance. "Brandon, please. Look at the weather," Valeria cried, her voice cracking as she stumbled. She held her heavy stomach with one hand, trying to keep her balance. "I'm 8 months pregnant. You can't do this to our baby." Brandon stopped and looked at her with eyes so cold they felt like needles. "My baby. You think I want a life tied to you forever? This was a business arrangement, Valeria. And the contract is over." With a brutal shove, he pushed her out onto the porch. The heavy oak doors slammed shut with a sound like a guillotine. The click of the deadbolt echoed through the thunder. Valeria stood there, stunned, as the freezing rain soaked through her thin dress in seconds. She hammered on the door until her knuckles bled, but the lights inside the house simply went out one by one. Brandon was going to sleep while his wife and child were left to the mercy of the storm. Valeria realized no one was coming to help. She turned toward the long, winding driveway, her feet slipping in her house shoes. Every step was a battle. The wind whipped her long hair across her face, blinding her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and a sharp, terrifying pain shot through her abdomen. "Just a little further," she whispered to her belly, her voice disappearing into the roar of the rain. But her body was at its limit. As she reached the edge of the estate's massive iron gates, her foot caught on a slick patch of pavement. She went down hard, her knees hitting the wet asphalt. She tried to push herself up, but her strength was gone. She rolled onto her side, curling around her baby, protectively tucking her chin as the shivering took over. The world began to fade into a blur of gray and black. She was going to die here, she thought. Brandon had won. But then, through the sheets of rain, a pair of blinding white headlights cut through the darkness. A massive black sedan crawled toward her, as silent as a ghost. The car didn't honk. It didn't swerve. It stopped inches from her shivering body. The door opened, and a pair of polished black boots stepped into the mud. Valeria looked up, her vision failing, and saw a man standing over her like a dark god. He didn't look like an angel sent to save her. He looked like the devil himself. "Who are you?" she wheezed. The man didn't answer. He simply knelt, his massive tattooed hand reaching out to steady her. He carried her to his car, and for the first time in months, Valeria felt something other than the cold. She felt a terrifying, dangerous heat. Valeria woke up to a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. For a second, she thought she was back in the mansion with Brandon, but the air was different. It didn't smell like his expensive cologne. It smelled of cedar, old books, and a faint, sharp scent of rain. She tried to sit up, but a bolt of pain shot through her side, reminding her of the fall on the wet pavement. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized she was in a bed larger than any she had ever seen. The sheets were black silk, cool against her skin. She looked down and saw that her soaked, ruined dress had been replaced with a soft, oversized cotton shirt. Panic flared in her chest. Who had touched her? Where was she? She scanned the room. It looked more like a fortress than a bedroom. The walls were dark stone, and the furniture was heavy and masculine. Then, her eyes landed on a figure sitting in a leather armchair in the far corner. Her breath hitched. It was the man from the road. In the low light, he looked even more terrifying. He was massive, his broad shoulders filling the chair. He had his suit jacket off now, and the sleeves of his black shirt were rolled up, revealing thick forearms covered in intricate, dark tattoos that snaked down to his knuckles. But it was his face that made her heart race. A sharp tattoo etched its way along his jaw and up his neck, and a thin scar cut through one of his eyebrows. He was watching her with an intense, calculating gaze that made her feel like a rabbit caught in a trap. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Where am I?" Valeria whispered, her voice trembling. She instinctively moved her hand to her belly, checking on her baby. "Who are you? Did Brandon hire you to take me away?" The man stood up, and Valeria couldn't help but shrink back into the pillows. He moved with a strange, quiet grace for someone so large. He didn't answer her questions right away. Instead, he walked over to a small table, poured a glass of water, and held it out to her. His hand was steady, and his eyes never left hers. "Brandon Whitmore is a fool who doesn't know the value of what he owns," the man said coldly. "And no, he didn't hire me. Most people pay me to make their problems disappear. They don't pay me to save them." Valeria took the glass with shaking hands, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to his icy expression. "My name is Viktor Sokolov," he continued. Valeria nearly dropped the glass. She had heard that name in whispers at Brandon's fancy parties. The feared czar of the underground. A man who dealt in shadows and blood. She was in the home of the most dangerous man in the city, and as she looked at the heavy, locked door, she wondered if she had traded one cage for another, one much more lethal. Over the next few days, Victor remained a shadow in the hallways of his massive estate. He didn't say much, and he certainly didn't offer any warm hugs, but Valeria began to notice things changing. Started with her phone. For days, it had been blowing up with hateful messages from debt collectors and alerts that her credit cards had been declined. Brandon had frozen everything, intending to starve her into submission. But one morning, she opened her banking app to find every balance cleared. A private wire transfer had wiped out her debts in a single stroke. When she confronted Victor about it as he sat in his study, he didn't even look up from his paperwork. "A woman in your condition shouldn't be worrying about decimals and interest rates," he said, his voice as deep as a landslide. "It's been handled." But that wasn't all. Later that afternoon, a team of top-tier specialists arrived at the estate. Valeria recognized one of them, Dr. Eris, the same doctor who had turned her away from the city's best clinic just 2 days prior because Brandon had revoked her insurance. The doctor looked pale, his hands shaking as he set up his equipment. Victor stood by the door, his large frame blocking the exit. He didn't have to pull a weapon. The tattoo on his neck and the coldness in his eyes were enough. "I believe you told Mrs. Cruz that your schedule was too full for her," Victor said quietly. The doctor swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Funny how a phone call can clear a man's calendar. I was mistaken, Mr. Sokolov. The doctor stammered. I'm here to provide the best care possible. Whatever she needs. Victor leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You will treat her like she is the most important person in this city. If I hear that she or the baby felt even a moment of discomfort because of your negligence, you won't have a medical license to worry about. Am I clear? The doctor nodded vigorously and immediately began the checkup with more care than Valeria had ever received in her life. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the room, Valeria watched Victor from across the hall. He was a man of violence, a man the world feared, yet he was the only one who had seen her as a human being instead of a problem. He provided everything she needed without asking for a single thank you. But as she saw him take a hushed, intense phone call about cleaning up the Whitmore mess, she realized that Victor wasn't just protecting her. He was preparing for a war. And she wasn't sure if the city was ready for what happened when a man like Victor Sokolov got angry on someone else's behalf. While Valeria rested in the quiet comfort of the Sokolov estate, the world outside was spinning a very different web. One evening, she clicked on the television in her room, only to see Brandon's face splashed across the screen. He was sitting in a high-end news studio, wearing a charcoal gray suit that screamed success, but his expression was one of practiced heartbreak. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, Business tycoon Brandon Whitmore pleads for missing pregnant wife. Valeria's jaw dropped. She watched in horror as Brandon squeezed out a fake tear for the cameras. I came home and found her gone, he told the interviewer, his voice trembling with a lie so perfect it made Valeria's skin crawl. Valeria has been struggling with the stress of the pregnancy. I'm terrified she's confused and out there in the cold. I just want her and our baby back home where they belong. He looked like the perfect grieving husband. Within minutes, the internet was flooded with messages of support for Brandon and judgment for Valeria. People called her ungrateful and unstable. They had no idea that just a few nights ago, that same man had pushed her into the mud and locked the door. A heavy hand landed on the back of Valeria's chair. She didn't jump. She knew the scent of cedar and rain by now. Victor was standing behind her, his dark eyes fixed on the television screen. His jaw was tight, and the tattoo on his neck seemed to darken with his rising anger. He's good, Victor remarked, his voice a low, dangerous hum. He's turning the whole city against you so that when he eventually finds you, he looks like the hero and you look like the problem. Everyone believes him, Valeria whispered, her eyes filling with tears. He's going to ruin my reputation before our baby is even born. How can I ever fight someone who owns the news? Victor leaned down, his face close to hers. Let him talk, Valeria. Let him build his tower of lies as high as he wants. It only makes the crash louder when I pull the foundation out from under him. He reached out and clicked the TV off, plunging the room into a calm, protective darkness. He thinks he's playing a game of PR. He doesn't realize he's actually started a war with me. Victor walked toward the door, already pulling his phone from his pocket. Sleep, Valeria. Tomorrow, the world finds out that Brandon Whitmore isn't a victim. He's a target. Valeria watched him leave, feeling a strange mix of relief and terror. She was safe for now, but she knew that once Victor Sokolov stepped into the light, nothing would ever be the same again. The loop was open. How would a criminal expose a saint without getting caught himself? As the days turned into weeks, the fragile woman who had collapsed in the mud began to disappear. In her place stood someone new. Valeria no longer spent her mornings weeping over old photos of Brandon. She spent them walking through the sun-drenched halls of the Sokolov estate, her head held high. Her pregnancy had reached its final stage, and though her body felt heavy, her spirit felt lighter than it ever had in the golden cage of her marriage. She realized that being protected by Victor wasn't just about the guards at the gate or the high stone walls. It was about the way he treated her. In Brandon's house, she had been a decorative object. In Victor's house, she was a person whose voice actually mattered. One evening, she found Victor in the dining room, surrounded by maps and legal documents. He looked exhausted, his dark eyes shadowed by the weight of his empire. Without thinking, Valeria walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You should eat something, Victor. You're no good to anyone if you're running on fumes." The room went dead silent. The guards in the corners of the room stiffened, eyes wide. Nobody told Viktor Sokolov what to do. But Victor didn't snap. He looked up at her, and for a split second the feared Tsar mask slipped. He looked surprised, then almost grateful. "I suppose you're right," he grumbled, though a small, rare smirk played at the corner of his mouth. From that moment on, the dynamic shifted. Valeria started sitting in on his meetings, quietly listening as he managed his business. She began to understand the chess match he was playing against Brandon. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was becoming a part of his world. She found a strange, fierce strength in the way Victor stood up for her. When a local businessman tried to gossip about her disappearance, Victor didn't just ignore it. He bought the man's company and fired him. "Nobody speaks about you with anything but respect," Victor told her one night as they sat by the fire. "Not while I'm breathing." Valeria looked at his tattooed hands, the ones the world thought were only capable of destruction, and saw how gently they held the baby blanket she had been knitting. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was proud to be under his wing. But as her due date approached, a new fear crept in. Brandon was still out there, and he was getting desperate. He had started a legal battle to claim custody of a child he never wanted, just to hurt Valeria one last time. She looked at Victor, the man who had become her shield. "He's coming for the baby, isn't he?" Victor's eyes turned to cold flint. "Let him try. He thinks he's going to a courtroom. He doesn't realize he's walking into a trap I've been building since the night I found you." The loop was closing. The broken wife was gone, and the mother of the underground was ready to fight. But was she ready for the secret Brandon was about to leak to the press? The night of the City Heritage Gala was supposed to be Brandon Whitmore's crowning achievement. He stood in the center of the gold-leafed ballroom, holding a glass of champagne, soaking up the sympathy of the city's elite. He had spent weeks playing the heartbroken husband, and tonight, he was launching a massive charity in honor of his missing wife. It was the perfect PR move to cover his tracks. "It's been so hard," Brandon whispered to a group of reporters, wiping a fake tear. "I just want her and the baby home." Suddenly, the massive double doors of the ballroom swung open. The music didn't just stop, it died. Valeria stepped into the light, and the room gasped. She wasn't the broken, shivering woman Brandon had kicked into the mud. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue that draped perfectly over her pregnant silhouette, her dark hair flowing like silk. She looked like a queen returning to her throne. But it was the man beside her that turned the room into a freezer. Viktor Sokolov walked in with his hand firmly on Valeria's lower back. He didn't wear a tuxedo. He wore a sharp black suit that made him look like a shadow come to life. The black tattoos on his neck and hands were visible to everyone, a silent warning that the most dangerous man in the state was now the guardian of the woman Brandon had claimed was unstable. Brandon's face went from pale to ghostly white. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. "Valeria," he stammered, his voice cracking. "What is the meaning of this? Who is this man?" Victor stepped forward, his boots clicking rhythmically against the floor. He stood a full head taller than Brandon, his presence swallowing the light. "I believe you've been telling the city you were looking for your wife, Whitmore," Victor's voice rumbled, echoing in the silent hall. "Well, here she is. But I think you forgot to tell everyone how she ended up in my car in the middle of a storm." "She's confused," Brandon shouted, looking around desperately at the cameras. "She's been kidnapped. Security, remove this criminal." Nobody moved. The security guards, men who usually obeyed Brandon's every whim, stayed frozen. They knew exactly who Viktor Sokolov was. Valeria stepped toward Brandon, her brown eyes burning with a fire he had never seen. "I'm not confused, Brandon. And I'm not yours." She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a digital recorder. "The world heard your lies on the news. Now they're going to hear what you said to me on the porch that night." Brandon lunged for the device, but he didn't even get close. One look from Victor sent Brandon stumbling back, tripping over his own feet. The businessman realized, too late, that he had brought a polished suit and a few lies to a fight against a man who dealt in blood and truth. "The game is over, Brandon," Valeria said, her voice steady and cold. As the reporters began to swarm, Brandon realized his empire was collapsing in real time. But as Victor led Valeria away, he leaned in and whispered something that made her heart stop. The confrontation was won, but the real danger was just beginning. The downfall of Brandon Whitmore didn't happen with a bang, but with the steady, freezing precision of a winter storm. After the gala, the recording of his cruelty went viral, and his perfect reputation shattered overnight. His investors fled like rats from a sinking ship, and the board of directors removed him before the sun even rose the next morning. But Victor wasn't finished. He had spent weeks quietly buying up Brandon's debts through shadow companies. By the end of the month, Brandon didn't just lose his job. He lost his mansion, his cars, and his dignity. The final blow came when the police arrived at a cheap motel to arrest him for corporate fraud and the intentional endangerment of his wife and child. Brandon, the man who once thought he was untouchable, was led away in handcuffs, screaming at the cameras about how unfair it all was. Nobody listened. Even Elena, the woman he had chosen over Valeria, had already vanished with the last of his hidden cash. Across the city, the atmosphere was entirely different. In the quiet, sun-filled nursery of the Sokolov estate, Valeria sat in a rocking chair, looking down at the tiny sleeping miracle in her arms. Her daughter had been born healthy and strong, with dark hair and a spirit that already seemed unbreakable. The heavy door creaked open, and Victor stepped inside. He had just returned from finalizing the Whitmore business, but the coldness in his eyes melted the second they landed on the baby. He walked over, his massive tattooed hand reaching out to gently stroke the infant's cheek. The man the world feared was completely undone by a 5-pound girl. "She has your eyes," Victor whispered, his voice thick with a softness he only showed within these walls. Valeria looked up at him, her heart full. She thought back to the night she had been kicked out into the rain, broken and alone. She had thought her life was over, but it had actually just been beginning. She had traded a golden cage for a fortress of real love. "We're safe now, aren't we?" she asked. Victor leaned down and kissed her forehead, his presence a silent promise of protection that would never break. "You're more than safe, Valeria. You're home." As the city lights began to twinkle outside the window, Valeria finally closed her eyes, knowing that while the world might always fear the name Sokolov to her, it was the only name that meant peace. The storm had passed, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was finally being loved the way she deserved. Thank you for watching. Kindly subscribe for more interesting videos.